Today, we welcome to the program Yascha Mounk, who's a professor of the practice of international affairs at Johns Hopkins University, founder of the digital magazine Persuasion, contributing editor at The Atlantic, as well as host of the Good Fight podcast. His new book is The Identity Trap, a story of ideas and power in our time. Yascha, really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this today.
Thanks so much for having me on. I'm looking forward to talking to you.
So, let's just start with what's the identity trap? What is the identity trap that you discuss in your book that concerns you?
So there's a new set of ideas about race, gender, and sexual orientation that has come to be really influential over the course of the last years. Sometimes these ideas are called woke or a form of critical race theory. I find these terms unhelpful, so I talk about them as the identity synthesis. I think that's a better, more neutral term. Now, these ideas promise to make the world a better place. They promise that they are the best, the most systematic, the most decisive way to fight against injustices that are very real. And so a lot of people are lured into them. A lot of people are attracted to them because they want to fight against these injustices. They want to build a better world. As I argue and explain in the book, though, these ideas are a political trap. As we've seen in the last years, they often make it harder for progressive institutions to do the important work they're doing, to actually serve their missions. They divide us against each other, encouraging people to see themselves primarily in terms of the groups into which they're born in ways that encourage zero-sum conflict. And ultimately, they make it easier rather than harder for really dangerous far-right populists like Donald Trump to win political power. So, a trap is something that has a lure, that draws people in who are well-intentioned, who are smart, but it's ultimately counterproductive. Once you've fallen into the trap, something bad happens. This, I think, is the case with these ideas.
Do you believe that these ideas are more prevalent among, I guess it's hard to pick only one context. And as an international person, you might say, well, I'm more familiar with it here than there. But maybe for our audience, which is mostly in the United States, is this trap, have people on the American left or American right fallen for this trap to a greater degree?
It depends. It depends on what exactly you mean by this trap. So certainly on the right, there, has always been a form of identity politics. There's been slavery and Jim Crow, and there continue to be white supremacists who say we're going to prioritize the interests of whites over those of everybody else. I think in ideological terms, there's a definite structural similarity here, but it's a different set of ideas, right? This is an idea about history and tradition and the rights of the majority and the ethnic conception of nationalism, all of which I worry about deeply and I've written about extensively in my previous books. But I think they're a different set of ideas, right? What I do in this book is four things. First of all, I show the origin of these new ideas on the left that have taken the left from being more universalist, for trying to say that really we, across boundaries of culture and race, have all these important things in common that we share, and said, no, actually, we in many contexts can't understand each other. We have to defer to each other. The most important thing is not our social class; it is our skin color, our sexual orientation, and so on. So I show how this transformation happened. Secondly, I show how these ideas then became influential, and thirdly, when I critique some of the applications of these ideas to areas from free speech to cultural appropriation and so on. But what I demonstrate in process of that is that we're dealing with a novel ideology. One that I think deserves to be taken seriously. I enjoyed reading many of the theorists who helped to bring this set of ideas about, from Michel Foucault to Edward Said and Gayatri Spivak to people like Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw. I think they're worth taking seriously. But they really constitute a new set of ideas, and we also have to assess that critically. So to respond to your question, the thing that we should absolutely be worried about on the right, I think, is a slightly different set of ideas.
Yeah.
And one thing that I think is important to understand is that these ideas actually reinforce each other. But even for superficially, the quote-unquote woke and people like Donald Trump hate each other, right? But politically, they help each other It was Trump's election in 2016 that understandably scared people and made it harder to argue against these kind of ideas in more left-leaning spaces. But it's the
Yeah.
hold that these ideas now have over many institutions, which makes it more likely that somebody like Trump will get reelected in 2024.
So listen, I mean, as someone who is decidedly on the left, I find that you make some salient points in your book. I think the concern I have is that there seems to be a bit of a context that is not there, maybe, that makes me question, for example, the prevalence of some of these ideas, the origins of some of these ideas. Let me give you like some specific things, for example. So you talk a lot in the book about, as it applies to woke and the left part. I'll speak more to that because that's where I find myself politically. There's a lot of this, identity over universalism is bad for a number of different reasons, and here are its limitations. And as someone who's on the left myself, I've said many times that when identity is used as a cudgel, as a tool to silence, as a tool to actually simply do a different type of discrimination than what maybe we're trying to solve, I'm critical of it, period. There's no equivocation. When that's the case, I'm critical of it. I also recognize that there are circumstances where identity can actually usefully inform us about particular issues. To preserve cultural heritages, sometimes identity is useful. If there's a very specific injustice we've identified and want to address, identity may be a useful lens. And so I think maybe as I talk about it, I have two issues with the context or lack thereof in the book. One is sometimes identity is actually more useful than universalism in specific cases. And two, I continue to not find the evidence that some point to that the left is obsessed with identity politics. Yes, we can find individual stories from either academia or from social media or whatever the case may be. But all of the polling I look at least in the US, Yascha, suggests that progressives, Democrats, the left, however you call us, we're worried about preserving democracy. We're worried about the economy and jobs, labor, healthcare, climate change. And so the anecdotes fail to convince me that this is really the direction the left has gone.
So let me say a couple of things to this, right? First of all, I agree with you on the polling, right? One of the reasons why this is a really bad idea is that obsessing over these things makes for really bad politics. That's why I say that one is the yin to the other's yang. The way in which some of these ideas have captured a bunch of progressive institutions makes it easier for people like Trump to win because it drives people into his arms. There was a great analysis in the New York Times of the Republican electorate, and much of it is as you would expect. But about a tenth of it is people who are disproportionately young, disproportionately non-white, who are actually quite left-leaning on a bunch of cultural issues. They're pro-trans acceptance, they're pro-abortion, they on a bunch of things think of themselves as liberals or progressives on social issues. But they are so concerned about some of these ideas that they actually end up really voting for Donald Trump, right? So these are the kinds of people who might put him in the White House. Now, Bernie Sanders' campaign was much more effective in 2016 when he talked about the kinds of things you're talking about, right? About universal healthcare and social issues and economic class, than it was in 2020 when he started talking the language of some of these ideas much more strongly than he did 4 years ago. And there's a conscious pivot that a lot of members of his campaign engaged in. So that's the first thing.
That's interesting. I don't actually, just to interject one thing, I don't actually remember it being that way. I'm not saying it wasn't. It's just not my recollection of his 2020 campaign, but I think it's an interesting suggestion.
So I think if you look at his social media presence in 2016, and you look at his social media presence in 2020, you see a really marked difference in how much jargon there is, how much talk there is. And again, obviously in America, you have to stand up for the rights of people who are marginalized, and all of that is legitimate. He did that in 2016, he did that in 2020.
Sure.
But the word salad of different acronyms of sort of really just speaking for particular being embracing the activists of particular kind of subgroups and so on. A lot of that happened in 2020, but didn't happen in 2016.
Okay.
Just to speak to the broader point, as well, though, is this happening in society? Again, I don't think most Americans want this. I don't think most Americans agree with this. I don't think most progressives or left people want this. I'm on the left. I'm from the left. I don't want it, right? I still think of myself as being on the left, but in a lot of important institutions, it is happening. So let me give you two examples, right? Like,
Sure.
one is a woman I spoke to in researching this book called Carla Posey, who lives in the suburbs of Atlanta. She's an African-American educator, and she asked her school whether she could send her daughter to a particular teacher, a particular class that she preferred in the school. And the principal said, sure, of course, send me the name. But when Posey sent in the name, the principal kept deferring and demurring, and she got frustrated and said, what's going on here? And when the principal said, well, that's not the black class. That's not the class that the black kids go to. And you might think that this is some kind of form of racial segregation done by racists on the right. In this particular case, the principal was a black woman who's very progressive, who decided that for the right kind of identity formation of these kids, for them to see themselves as racial beings in the right way, they have to be around mostly other black kids or a minimum number of other black kids. And even for the mother said, hey, I want them to be in this other classroom because I happen to like the teacher for whatever reason. They have friends who went to the classroom. She said, no, I have to step in and make sure that that's not going to happen. And there is a wider trend of schools encouraging those kind of racially separated affinity groups in other contexts, right?
The problem I have with that is, and this is, I think, a broader issue I have with the book. You've cited an anecdote and saying this is broadly happening, but I'm not really finding evidence that it's broadly happening. And so then I wonder, you seem to be agreeing most progressives don't actually want this. You cite an anecdote and say there's more examples, but
David,
it really doesn't seem like it's widespread.
I have to say that the normal strategy on this, I had a debate about this with Nicole Hannah-Jones on Twitter the other day. She said, oh, this stuff isn't happening. I said, okay, so are you against it? So what? So what's the stance here? Is it this stuff?
I'm against it. Yeah, no, I'm
okay,
against
great.
it.
So,
yeah.
We're on the same page about that. But what I find
100%.
a lot of the time in these discussions is that people sort of ambiguate in this weird way between it's not happening, and if it is, then perhaps it's good. Now, I can tell you, if you look at Embrace Race, one of the most influential, progressive, educational, pedagogical organizations with huge influence, mostly in private schools, they talk about this kind of stuff. You can see, a lot of the leading private schools in this country now that are very influential have embraced this kind of stuff. Let's go to an example of public policy, right? If you don't like the educational example, let's talk about
before we move on, it's not that I don't like it. And again, I don't think that there's a hypocrisy, or I don't think there's a conflict between this isn't really prevalent and also I'm against the anecdotal stories you're telling me. It can be both, right? It can be, the issue I have more is the context of your book suggests it is super prevalent, but we can still say it's not as prevalent as you suggest, while I am still against it when it takes place. I don't see that as a problem or as a double standard.
No, you're clear about that. I think a lot of people ambiguate between those two things.
Gotcha.
You've been very clear, and that's fine. We can discuss how prevalent it is. I think it is. We have different assessments of that. I think it's more prevalent than you think it is. I can give you further examples and so on. But that's a good way to assume. Now, what I want to say is, by the way, no matter how prevalent it is, I think it's helpful to formulate the best case against these ideas. If you agree with me that this is a problem, let's talk about it. And I'm not somebody who's only ever talked about this, right? Like my last two books were about the threat of far-right populism, right? I like to say I'm a democracy crisis hipster. I worried about the crisis of democracy before it was cool. The way that I made my academic reputation, my public standing, is by warning about far-right populists before Donald Trump entered politics. And I wrote endless articles about how terrible he is, and I continue to believe that he's terrible and that he's a deep threat, right? So if we think that these are bad ideas and that they're at least somewhat prevalent in these spaces, I think it behooves us to try and understand them, right? Now, you can tell me
I agree with you. I think
something else.
The concern, it's not about let's talk about something else. I think the concern is this in the United States. Okay, so I'll speak to what's happening here, in my opinion. In the United States, the allegations of an obsessive identitarianism have been overwhelmingly hurled at the left, where I see the prevalence actually on the right, including nationalism as a form of identitarianism, religious identity and the idea that some elected officials in positions of power are now saying the U.S. either is or should be an overtly Christian country when it comes to civil government, et cetera. The real America or America First type ideology, which is extraordinarily identitarian. Tucker Carlson type statements about the browning of America and immigrants making the country dirtier and poorer. I find that there is a serious problem along these lines, but
I
it
agree.
has more
I
power
agree.
on the right, and thus that's where we should focus, is my opinion.
Well, so let me distinguish between two things. One
Sure.
is that the most serious problem? Yes, absolutely. I
Oh, okay,
agree.
good.
The other is that the only thing we should focus on? I'll tell you one thing. When I started writing about the threat of populism, I was one of the first, right? You look up the People versus Democracy. It was reviewed everywhere. It was talked about a lot. It became a very prominent book because it was one of the first books out on this subject, right? At this point, 5 years later, I can't count the number of books about populism. I can't count the number of books about Donald Trump. I've written hundreds of articles about various bad things Donald Trump has done. I continue to write them occasionally. I have to say, if after 10 years this guy is still in power, or not in power right now, but it's still, running even with Joe Biden in polls. I don't think one more column by me in the Atlantic denouncing Donald Trump is going to make a difference right now.
No,
And
and
B,
that's not my
perhaps
point.
we should look in the mirror. But the other thing is,
Yeah.
this is a topic that there isn't serious books about. The only people who've written about this so far are actually people who are on the right explicitly, who do support people like Donald Trump or Ron DeSantis. So I think actually taking this ideology seriously, explaining where these genuinely new ideas come from, but have
Yeah.
changed clearly how people on the left think about many of these issues.
I think
Tracing
that
the
that's
intellectual
worth it.
origin and then critiquing them in a serious way, when that, I think, is a market that hasn't been filled, when there's a space that is empty, where actually we need serious intellectual engagement,
We do.
is, I think, a worthwhile thing. Now, this is the one damn book I'll write about this. I've written 4 books about other topics. I'm going to
Sure.
go on and hopefully write 10 books about other topics after that. But I just don't quite understand this kind of, why are you talking about this, not about that?
Well, no,
Well,
it's
at
not.
least
It's not
walk
that. I
and jump
think
at the same time and talk about both sets of things.
we should talk about both sets of things. I think I would say 2 things. One, for almost 15 years, Federico Finkelstein has been writing along similar lines to what we're talking about here, and it is a critique from the left. And I think his work is very important. I think he's now at the New School. He's from Argentina, like I am. I think it's not about talk about one thing or the other. It's that the way these conversations are framed in the U.S., I'm not blaming you for this, but I think it's relevant, is they are out of proportion to the nature of the problem. And so if we agree that, and it's not about Trump specifically, if we agree that the overwhelming identitarianism is coming from the right, we should simply critique it in proportion to its prevalence. That's all I'm saying. I'm not saying don't talk about anything. I'm just saying I find that the conversation...
But is it legitimate for me to write this book or not? It's not like
it's absolutely legitimate. It's absolutely legitimate for you to write it and for us to have a conversation to contextualize it. I think both are totally legitimate.
Sure, that's fine. That's fine. But let me then say something else important, which is how to argue against this stuff, right? Because here's a basic question, right? On the right, there is this form of identity politics, right? People on the right do want to prime white Americans to defend their privileges, to defend their social standing, for example, right? Now, here's why stuff like these school examples, and I wanted to go to other examples. There are lots of other examples of this. It's not just about schools, right?
Sure.
But here's where this stuff gets me, right? You have students, teachers come into classrooms in 3rd grade, 2nd grade, 1st grade, telling students, if you're black, you go over there. If you're brown, you go over there, right? If you're Asian, you go over there. If you're white, you go over here. One of the things that worries me is what's going to happen to these white kids. And I don't worry about it in the sense that they'll be uncomfortable. It's fine to be uncomfortable in your education sometime. I don't care, right?
Yep.
What I worry about is everything I know from history and from social science, which is that how you define yourself is really dependent on the context. People across history have defined themselves in vastly different ways, and people in the United States today define themselves in vastly different ways.
Right.
But once you have said, this is my in-group, this is how I define myself, virtually everybody then prefers the interests of this group over those of the out-group, is much more likely to treat with compassion and courage members of the in-group, and much less likely to treat decently and fairly members of the out group. So what's going to happen to these white kids? Are they going to become great activists against white privilege and great anti-racists? Some of them will, I'm sure, but I think it is much more likely to inspire many of them to actually become racist. So there's a question about how do you respond to that threat from the right? Is it by
Yeah.
leaning into identities and saying America is going to be better if we all just double down on our identity, own our European heritage, as some schools explicitly want the white students to do? No, I think that is completely misguided. And so I situate myself in what I think of as the proudest American political tradition, which goes from Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln to people like Martin Luther King, and I would argue in some ways people like Barack Obama. And they were very, very willing to call out injustices, right?
I
Frederick
agree.
Douglass, when invited to talk about the 4th of July, said, "You hypocrites, right? You invite me to talk about how wonderful it is that all men are born equal. Well, there's people still enslaved in this country. How can I celebrate that sentence today?" But he doesn't say, let's get rid of that sentence. He doesn't say, let's get rid of those principles. He says, if you're serious about it, live up to them. And these are, in fact, noble ideals, but we have to turn them into a reality. And that is the tradition that I think is most capable of standing up to the right, of winning political victories to that part of the right, of actually making sure that the ethno-nationalist idea of the United States doesn't win out. So that's one of the reasons why I care about this, because I
Yeah.
care
And I think the question,
tradition.
I think the question that you say of how do you, if we agree that we don't want these ideas on the left, how do we argue against them? The way I've argued against them when people on the left call into my show, and it's not the most common thing, but it does happen, is, hey, we will actually create the very division we are trying to solve when we do these sorts of things. When we oversimplify identity or get it wrong, which I've talked about, as a Jewish immigrant from Argentina, am I white or not? It depends who you ask. The white supremacists say I'm very much not white. Some of the left-wing identity politics people say I have all the privilege of a white person and therefore I am a white person, right? We talk about
says you're Latino, probably.
The census says I'm Latino. Exactly. The risk of essentialism. I think, and also the point that when the focus on identity becomes too single-minded, we eclipse broader issues as well. I think these are some of the ways that I, as someone on the left, fight these ideas when they are coming from the left.
But David, you've read the book, right? I talk about this stuff in the book in exactly these terms. I trace the origin of some of these ideas to Gayatri Spivak, really interesting post-colonial literary scholar, taught at Columbia University for many decades, still does in her 80s. And she was reacting to a critique of identity that's rooted in the work of Michel Foucault, right? Foucault worries, Foucault in our terms is gay or homosexual. He doesn't like that term because he thinks it constrains his concept of identity too much, that the variety of sexual experience is such that just to say you're gay is too simplistic, right? And Spivak is responding to that. And she's deeply influenced by Foucault and Derrida and other postmodernist and post-structuralist thinkers. And she kind of buys the philosophical critique of essentialism. But she's also saying, hey, I want to speak for the subaltern in places like India who need somebody to speak for them because they don't have resources, they don't have the education, they don't have the standing to speak for themselves. And if I want to speak for them, then I need categories of identity. And so she coins this term of strategic essentialism, of saying that for strategic purposes, we should encourage these essentialist views of identity because that's how people are going to fight against injustice. Very reasonable thought in that time. Now, I make 2 points in the book. Number one, that is what helps to explain these kind of examples we've been talking about in educational spaces and other things, right? So it has a serious intellectual history. That's why people are attracted to it. And that's plausible. I get that. But number two, I think that ends up going wrong. And Spivak herself came to agree with that. She said that her concept of strategic essentialism just ended up being the union ticket for a more vulgar form of essentialism. So you get people saying, of course, race is a social construct, but then they go on to talk as though race was not a social construct, and those kind of subtleties you're talking about did not exist. And so Spivak herself came to worry, in allusion to the tea wallahs who sell cups of tea in the streets of India, delicious chai. She came to worry about the identity wallahs at American universities. So surely the book does engage with these ideas in a serious and a subtle way.
Do you worry at all about, listen, I basically, we have a very similar view on this, even if we don't have an exactly identical assessment of the proportions in which these elements are represented on the political spectrum. Do you worry at all that there is a degree to which these conversations are limited by fears about how the conversations will be perceived and the repercussions that could be had, such that you can't really openly say, hey, this thing is not the most pressing problem, but it is a problem, and as such, we should fully discuss it? That's where I'm finding that sometimes I meet resistance, which is where I say, listen, I'll grant you, no matter the political orientation of the person I'm speaking with, I will grant you that these things are bad. You grant me that they are not as prevalent as maybe you're implying. But now let's really have a full conversation about it without needing to keep our guard up around those issues. That's where I find the difficulty is, because people aren't willing to have a full conversation.
I think that's right. And look, one of the things I say in the book, by the way, is that a lot of people are scared to argue against these ideas because they think the moment they do, they're going to get canceled. And I think I get where those fears are coming from. There's some real stories of people suffering, I think, unfair consequences for expressing their views on things in, unfortunate ways, or in ways that actually are perfectly reasonable, but, just in the wrong context, or they just got unlucky. But I tell people in the end, I think if you talk about this stuff in a principled way, in one that's based in your deepest convictions for how to build a better world, and you try to claim the moral high ground and actually argue from your highest convictions, most of the time you'll be fine. And it's important that people do that, right? So I don't want to be an alarmist about these things. And the wider thought I have is that. And I don't think you're doing that. I think you are inviting that conversation. I appreciate that. But I think there's people who are a little bit clever by half about it, where it's like, okay, look, there's some problems. I can see, a friend of mine who was really skeptical when I used to talk about this stuff. And I didn't see her for a few years. And I saw her again after the pandemic. And the moment she saw me in a sort of crowded room, she made a beeline for me across the way and said, hey, Yascha, I see what you've been going on about now, because the really progressive organization with a really important mission that she worked at just tore itself apart over the course of a pandemic, right? And she's like, okay, I can see how this actually affected my work, right? So I think a lot of people are seeing that, but I think there's a little bit of this kind of clever by half strategic instinct of like, this might hurt us, the wrong people might exploit this, so let's not talk about this. And I think that's always a mistake, because people aren't stupid. I'm a Democrat in the partisan sense, but I'm also a Democrat in this moldy sense of like, I actually think that most people are smart enough to live in a democracy. And when there's problems, they smell it, they can tell. And if we don't talk about them openly, if we don't say, hey, we disagree with some of this stuff, then we're going to be lured in by the only people who do say that. And those often are reactionaries, right? The people like somebody I wrote about in the New York Times excerpt of his book that ran recently, Brett Weinstein, who started off opposing, for good reason, some of the excesses of his ideology on the college campus he was at Evergreen State University, but now is saying that doctors who recommend that kids get vaccinated
off
should
the rails.
have Nuremberg 2 trial, right?
Yep.
Do we want these people to be the only people who are expressing their concerns about this ideology, or do we want to have a conversation about it?
Absolutely. The book is The Identity Trap, a story of ideas and power in our time. We've been speaking with the book's author, Yascha Mounk. Really appreciate your time and insights today.
That was fun. Thank you, David.